Thanks for joining us, guys, to number 3 in the Mythgard Movie Club. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We're so excited that Karey is here so we can kind of combine forces for Mythgard Academy and the movie club and hopefully get some good discussion going. I think we had a few announcements of upcoming events that we wanted to kind of let you know ahead of time first.
Yes. So, well, for those of you who are doing that Mythgard Academy, we're currently on the War of the Ring. And I just was realizing right before we're starting, I have that up there on Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern, which is true most weeks, but not next week, right? Like,
that's correct, yeah.
That'll be 2 Wednesdays from now.
Exactly.
We'll restart with that.
Yeah.
Also, coming up, we've got some really cool stuff through the Signum Symposia series. Rob Goslin's going to be presenting his thesis, which is on subcreation. It's really good. I've actually read it. It's really interesting. I've read it because he, cites my own thesis in it. So he sent me a copy. So it's a really good thesis because it's got some really good source materials. No, but or maybe despite the source materials. Also coming up, there in March, about a month from now, is something I thought was really interesting. We're going to have a transhumanism in literature roundtable, which I wasn't even sure what that meant and had to look that up when I saw the event page come through there. So that looks like it's going to be pretty interesting, like singularity consciousness in robots, that type of stuff for anyone who's interested there. Also coming up, we've got, I know Karey's been promoting this one pretty hard, the London Moot in April, which registrations are going on now, and I think the call for papers and stuff is still going on.
Yep, definitely.
So you can go to londonmoot.com and find out more about that. Whether you're in Europe or not, people I think are going, some from here in the US too.
It's true, yeah.
And then we've got, in June, we've got, of course, Mythmoot coming up. The CFP is still up for that. We've got all of the registration and lodging information is all there in the event section of the Signum University website. And then another big thing happening this summer, pretty much right after Mythmoot, is we're going to be having our Signum Academy reading camps. And you can see the 4 books there. One of those books will be something we're talking about here coming up soon in our next Mythgard Movie Club session, Wrinkle in Time. And of course, redoing The Hobbit and expanding out to Lion, Witch of the Wardrobe, Harry Potter and Sorcerer's Stone, and Wrinkle in Time. So just want to make sure folks were aware of there. You can learn more at these web addresses on the internet. And yeah. And let's not forget, of course, our next movie club session.
The most important events of all get a slide, all of their own. So next up, we have the new adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time, which I am very excited about. It's a favorite book of mine from childhood. And
we'll have some new panelists who are very passionate about that story. So
I was just going to say, we've got some people whose names people know, but who are new to the movie club. So, regular Signum, attendees, Sharon Hoff, Sparrow Alden, and Kay Ben Abraham are all going to be on that panel. And I think Curtis is the only one who's not read and fallen in love with this book yet. So
I have never read it. I know Tesseract has something to do with it, but I don't know anything about the story.
Yes.
And I know some people are very excited about this adaptation and others are very wary of it. So I anticipate some good debate.
I saw a preview in the theater when the second time I went to see whatever it was, the Star Wars movie, and I was impressed. I thought it looked very interesting. Definitely not what I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was other than what I was expecting.
I think that's true for book readers as well.
Yeah.
It definitely they are going for better or worse, they're charting their own kind of path. So I think that's going to be a really good session.
Yeah.
So that's on March 29th. And then after that, we are going to do Alien, the Ridley Scott classic. So, that's our first kind of foray into, going a bit older, a few, decades now. So that's going to be coming up May 3rd.
Which may be surprising. I've never seen that either. So
Really?
Really?
Wow.
I've seen subsequent movies in the series, but I've never seen the original. So that'll be another new one for me. But anyway.
Yeah, this is the subtitle of this series this year is getting Curtis out, to see the world, eventually.
This is all a project.
Get out of your comfort zone.
All right, so first of all, half the movies that we're doing are first run movies this year. So you can't blame me for ones that aren't even in the theaters yet.
It's not an excuse.
You can blame me for not reading the books.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
But also, I do want to say the one movie I really hoped we would get to do this year did not get chosen. So you can't blame me for that. Anyway.
That's hard.
So in case anybody thinks we completely rigged the system, Curtis's pick didn't make it.
Maybe I'll have to convince Corey to do that one during our next webathon fundraiser. Special. All right, so to the movie at hand. So I'm gonna
hold on before we start. Let's briefly introduce ourselves, just because people might not know who we are. So I guess I'll go first. I'm Kat, and Curtis and I are sort of spearheading this movie club project. We also do a podcast called Kat and Kurt's TV Review, where we talk about science fiction and fantasy TV series at a deliciously slow pace. So that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years, and we're both, or I'll speak for myself, I'm a recent Mythgard and Signum grad. I'm an academic coordinator for University of Pennsylvania by day, and by night I do the same thing for Signum. So
I was gonna make a joke about that, Kat. I'm like, and by night she mixes it up. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I just pretty much do the same thing. So if you've taken classes with Signum, you've probably exchanged emails with me. So yeah.
So I'm Kurt, and Kat. Up until the academic coordinator thing, pretty much everything she said. I am a digital marketer by trade, and I do some of that for Signum too at night. So I guess this is all just means we're just gluttons for punishment, or we're in really well, the fields of our careers that we've chosen. Just we really love them that much that we do them for Corey on the side as well.
Excellent. Excellent. And I'm Corey Olson. I think, looking at the list of names, I think most people here know who I am. I'm Corey Olson. I'm the Tolkien professor. We just finished, of course, our discussion of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book, and we talked a little bit, anyway, about the original radio dramas. And I forbore to talk about the film adaptation because I was looking forward to joining this fun panel to talk about it together. So I am delighted to be invited to come and talk about this film with all of these other wonderful people with whom it is such an honor to be grouped here.
Am I next?
Yes.
I'm Kelly. Hi. I'm Kelly. I've been with Signum and Mythgard since 2012, so a while now. And I'm just about to start really, my thesis. But then we finished with my master's. And by day, I'm a bookseller. So same thing. I talk about books all day, and then I go to Signum and I talk about books even more. So happy to be here.
A bookseller at the coolest bookstore on the West Coast. I mean, it's not like you're just any old bookseller, right?
Yeah, Mysterious Galaxy does science fiction and fantasy. So I just talk about dragons all day, guys. Very cool.
I changed my mind. I'm not in the right career. I want that one. Yes.
Come to San Diego.
I'm Dominic, and I talk about politicians all day. I'm a political scientist by
trade. So
you
talk about dragons too. So see, there you go. It's very similar.
Pretty much, except not as pretty.
Right.
Political scientist by day, but I've actually tried to combine that interest with my interest in science fiction and fantasy. Every once in a while, I've been known to write articles or blog posts about politics in Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. I might be working on something about Dune this summer. I also blog occasionally on my website, Nardy Views. So if you want to check out more of my work there, I have taken some Signum classes, so I have done that in the past as well. So I'm here more as a casual fan of Hitchhiker's Guide. So that's me.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Mike Moore seems to be implying that I should apologize to dragons for my previous remark. I'm sorry if I offended any dragons who were in attendance.
Fair enough. All right. So sorry for jumping the gun. Thank you, Kat, for setting me back on track, which is like mostly of what our podcast is about too.
That's pretty much what Kat does. Yeah, absolutely.
So I know a lot of times we sort of jump in and kind of get first impressions on the film, but I want to take the opportunity here to, this is a new thing, right? Like as far as we're only 3 of our movie club sessions in, the first one we did, Eternal Sunshine, was just a standalone story and had a really great discussion. The second one was that Star Wars film. What was that called again, Corey? The Last Jedi.
Whatever. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, whatever that was.
Revenge of the Force.
Which was of course a new a new installment in a series, but wasn't an adaptation or anything. So this is our first movie that's an adaptation of a previous story or several previous stories. And I really like this quote from William Thomas, who reviewed the film back in 2005 when it first came out, and said, "This movie adaptation of the TV adaptation of the novelization of the radio series is about as faithful as you can get." And when I read that, my immediate question was, as faithful to what? Like, you just named 4 different things. What is the story here faithful to? And there's other adaptations that he doesn't even name in there. And so kind of in discussing, Hitchhiker's Guide specifically, I also wanted to just kind of take the opportunity to say, like, from a high level, like how do we address this sort of thing in the movie club? Like, we can set some precedent here. What, to what must we be faithful when we talk about adaptations, and need we be faithful to anything, and all of that. So I threw up here, I just kind of listed out the adaptations at least I knew of, and just kind of want to throw out that question of, like, is it possible or even desirable to try to talk about the film without discussing the adaptations, or its predecessors actually? Is it necessary? Like, if we do that, are there some that we should be relying on more than others? And then I threw this last question in just of, like, I saw this a lot of, like, people doing, I guess, the crit-fic thing of, like, Adams would not have liked this movie. And it's like, well, how do you know? Like, just because it was different or whatever. So, yeah, I don't have I'll just throw that out to the group if anyone has some burning thoughts to start with, or we can just kind of go around and get people's thoughts on that. So yeah, anyone have any burning answer or thoughts about it? How any of these things are?
Well, my first thought is, of course, like, if we're asking the question of, what are we being faithful to? My first thought is, of course, we should be faithful to anything that Douglas Adams, like the creator of this original play, text, whatever, actually wrote. But I actually don't know the history. Like, I know he did the radio broadcast, but the other things that you mentioned, the live action TV show or text-based computer game, I actually don't know his involvement with this. I know that he was involved with the movie, but I don't know. Does anyone know what kind of sort of levels that Douglas Adams was involved with the other adaptations?
Well, I know he was in.
He was involved with the computer games, definitely. I think he wrote some text-based computer games. So, and the novelization, obviously. And I'm not sure the TV show. Does anybody know?
Yeah, I think that he was involved with the TV show as well. Yeah,
I'm almost positive. In fact, I think he was like very protective of the story. From what I understand, I'm not the spoiler, my introduction to the Hitchhiker's Guide stories is through the movie we're about to talk about. Right. So I'm certainly not like a lifelong fan or whatever of all the different versions. The versions that I'm aware of and have seen, I've seen within like the past month in preparation for this, other than the book, which I had read, but read after I first saw the movie. So from what I understand, though, from my research, is that he was very protective of the story, very much liked being involved in all the things. And even when he I don't want to jump the gun on the Doctor Who stuff, but I know, like, for example, when he pulled stories out of Doctor Who, he liked the stories and then adapted them to, like, the Hitchhiker's Guide universe. So, you know, he very much had that sort of level of control over pretty much all of these things. Now, I threw in, like, also different versions because I was struck, Corey, by something you said in the Mythgard Academy thing about listening to the audio book version, specifically in reference to, I think it was footnotes, and the footnote specifically that talks about Ford Prefect, and how, like, you didn't even realize it was a footnote when you were listening to it. So, like, things like that are even sort of incidental, but can kind of subtly change how we understand the story or how we approach it. And so I feel like even if it's not like a different version per se of the story, it's like a slightly different presentation or whatever of the story there. Well,
and so Sharon in the chat pointed out that even if he was protective and involved in all these different adaptations, there are differences between them. So subtle though they may be, he wasn't above changing things when he thought there might be a better way of doing something that might fit the format that he's working in. So, you know, even the most jealous kind of creator, I think, if they're doing new versions of their work, they're subtly sort of evolving it each time they do it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And that to me is one of the things that makes this most interesting in thinking about it as an adaptation, right? Because we don't just have a book and then a film derived from the book, right? I mean, that's not the kind of situation that we have here. We have this, you know, again, as William Thomas is suggesting in that you know, really neat quote, this is the end of a long chain of adaptation, and Adams being involved so actively in so many of those different adaptations. And there are very significant differences. I mean, there's of course much that's retained from the radio broadcasts to the book, for instance, as we were talking about in the Mythgard Academy class. But I find the changes pretty radical. For myself, I would not say that there is that when I look at the differences between the book and the film, I don't think that those differences are not, in my mind, much more radical than the changes between the radio broadcast and the book. You know, the changes that Adams himself made when he adapted his own story. I'm not saying that they're the same changes that he would have made, but I'm saying the quantity of change, the amount of difference between them is I don't find it radically different. And so obviously to say, oh, they changed it, Adams wouldn't approve, seems to me silly. He himself did lots of changes of this kind. You know, even though so much is retained, so many of the jokes and so much of the dialogue from the radio broadcast to the book, the whole shape of the story, shape and focus and narrative of the story really changes very dramatically, I find. So yeah, you know, the shifts that we get in the film don't seem to me radically different. But yeah, so as always, I think, you know, the best thing we can do is sort of look at the film on its own ground and then be doing some comparison and contrast, but, you know, sort of cognizant of the fact that we're contrasting with either something like really fluid, right, on its own, or to like a number of different things. And we can't, you know, there is no one single in this case, as much as any other example I can think of, there is no like essential text, right? There is no original. There's really nothing to be faithful to. It's a series of different versions of this. And so it's really just to compare this to sort of all of them, really.
I wonder how much of this, though, is driven by the nature of Hitchhiker's Guide as a story, in that Curtis, we were talking, and Kat, we were talking about before the started about how, in a lot of ways, Hitchhikers is a story about a series of moments rather than a cohesive narrative. Right. It isn't really about Arthur Dent's character arc so much as it is about a series of witty, funny, clever moments strung along together. So I wonder if that type of story is a bit more interchangeable than, say, like a Lord of the Rings or a Dune, where Paul Atreides has to have a certain character arc. So if you take part of his character arc out of the story in a movie adaptation, you might actually be missing part of his journey.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. One of the main characters, as you will, is actually the guide. So I feel like if you have the guide in every, you could add on passages from the guide in that same sort of style and the same sort of jokes, and still have the spirit of the original play, book, all of that.
Right.
And what's interesting is, of course, even in the midst of the story itself, the guide itself is being edited, right? Even if it's only to add mostly before harmless,
right?
Like that guide itself is being updated. And I only watched like the first couple episodes of the TV show, but I feel like they make even a bigger deal there. Ford Prefect does about like, oh, I'm sending edits like to the editor of the guide as we're going along, and talking about it. So, like even if you're using that as your basis, like that in and of itself is being edited as the story progresses.
And one of the things, it is, you're right. And one of the things that's really funny there for me, of course, is that I was listening to the audiobook version, which isn't an adaptation, it's a performance of the book. But of course, it's Stephen Fry who reads the audiobook. So in the film, right when there are whole chunks of the film that in my personal experience, I'm like, that was exactly the book. They just had the book right there because it's Stephen Fry reading the same passages in the same inflection that he read the audiobook. So that was actually almost surreal. I almost... quite unprecedented, actually, in my movie watching experience, to have the chunks of an audiobook that I know really well being read to me, on a film. That was really funny.
Well, and what's interesting there too is, like you're getting that, but then you're getting visual things that there's no cue about. So I'm thinking of like when I forget the name of the fictional author who writes the series, the trilogy of books about God, right? And it's like, God's greatest mistake, and then like more mistakes, like, and you're seeing like it pops up, and there's like the symbol for males and the symbol for females, and like you're like, it adds just kind of another layer to whatever you might have been thinking about that book was about. It's like suddenly about these other things that probably weren't, at least for me. I saw the movie first, but
right.
Wouldn't have been like probably on my mind if I had approached it from the radio or the book first. So I think we kind of are all in agreement that like we can compare and contrast, but maybe don't have to like take too seriously whatever precedents come before. And I can't say that I'm surprised by the group we have here that would be sort of the consensus, but I did at least want to bring it up because it was sort of the first opportunity we've had here.
And it's definitely a fascinating question in regards to this. I as I say, I don't really know another example like this. The only thing I can think of would be something like a film which is dealing with like a comic book tradition concerning which books have also been written, and then you in multiple authors and things like that, where you're really dealing with more of a sort of a culture of story than like the adaptation of a particular book. But Adams's own the sort of the dominant personality of and voice of Adams going through almost all of those adaptations makes this different even from something like that. So.
Right, it is different in that if you kind of want to pick an original, there very clearly is one. It doesn't kind of the radio play is the original text, but I wonder, is it just a matter of what exerts the most gravity? The novel came along and for whatever reason sort of seems to have kind of superseded it culturally. That a lot of people don't even realize that there was a radio drama originally, that this is, a book first and foremost. But the book is as much an adaptation as the movie is, but maybe people don't like the movie, so they don't count that as much, not realizing that they count the book, even though the book didn't come first either. And so I think it's just, this is a really interesting kind of case study in what people consider the official text.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring up, and more to the last question, do we care if Adams would have liked the final film? I don't know if we should care, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there's should we care as analysts of the story, but there's also should we care from a marketing perspective. And I think one of the things that gets tangled up in this debate is that these films and Hitchhiker's Guide was advertised in this way as, it was advertised as being loyal to the book, and much of the advertising talked about how Adams was involved. And there was this effort to depict it as having had his seal of approval. So I think that's sometimes where this debate about whether or not Adams would have liked the final film comes up, and you see that this on other adaptations as well. And that's sometimes we just have to put the marketing discussion to one side and the story analysis to another side. So I'm presuming we're gonna from here on out we're going more to the story analysis.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'm going to, Dom, you brought up narrative. So this slide is just a number of other reviews that I ran across, snippets from a number of other reviews that I ran across. One of the things that I really found interesting, sort of the left side is the more negative and the right side is more positive, although some of them are still kind of tepid either way. But one of the things that I really found interesting was about the narrative. There seems to be a lot of agreement that the narrative does not play a strong role in this movie. Not to say that there's no narrative or plot or whatever, but that there are a lot of moments. It's like Roger Ebert says, it's more about moments than an organizing purpose. Another reviewer who reviewed it favorably said it's a charming mess, but a mess all the same. And just kind of that idea that even amongst critics who are sort of either really disliked it or really liked it or were kind of in the middle, that all seemed to be the one thing that came across. And so on that note, then on the marketing side of things, we get the co-writer, Karey Kirkpatrick, who took care of the script after Douglas Adams passed away, and kind of said that Adams had admitted that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a story with a long beginning and then an ending, and there's no middle, and you kind of need a middle. So I guess the question is, if Karey Kirkpatrick saw that this story needed a middle, and everyone's saying, well, it doesn't really have much of a narrative, was that a successful addition, first of all? And then if not, does that make... Well, I guess we could also wonder, do we agree with what Douglas Adams purportedly said about his own story? Again, going back to which version is he talking about here? But I think, Corey, you had made the comment in the last class of the book discussion, or actually, I guess it would have been the radio drama discussion, that it is more about moment to moment and less of sort of a plot through line from episode to episode. So does that mean that the movie is actually closer to the original source than some of the later stuff that might have more of a narrative or not. I don't know. And yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say that certainly, I would say that's one of the things that's very noticeable from the radio drama to the book is increased narrative structure. Now, the book still is not overabundant with narrative structure, but compared to the radio drama, it is, which is much more, I was about to say episodic, which I think is the same mistake I made when of course it's episodic, it's in episodes, but I mean, like, even within each individual episodes, they're just kind of going from one place to another, sometimes without transition, like literally, like there's just a sound effect and suddenly the characters are in a different place and it's not even explained how they got there or what happened, right? So I mean, that kind of radical lack of narrative continuity is one of the things that you see in the radio drama. In the book, at least, it's a contiguous story. But certainly, I think that the film certainly has a much, I guess the thing I would say is an increased interest in cause and effect. Even just thinking of the scene that you have the image from there, right?
Yeah.
The film answers a question which is never even addressed in the book, which is, why Arthur? Why does Ford choose to save Arthur's life, right? No rationale is given for this. I mean, they're friends, I guess, but you get the impression that Ford also had other friends, right? Why has he singled out Arthur Dent to be the one that he like the one human being he saves from off the earth? The film gives an answer to that, right? Because when he first arrived, Arthur saved his life, and so, Ford was returning the favor. That kind of thinking, right? That kind of cause and effect thinking is exactly the kind of thing that we so often don't get. And partly it seems that, again, even in the book, especially Arthur, right? The story just sort of happens to Arthur. And sometimes I think it's kind of sticking to his perspective because he certainly is not in control. He is least in control of all the characters. At least Trillian is not in control either, but at least she knows how to drive the ship, right? So in that sense, she is more in control than Arthur is. But Arthur is just, he's just being carried from one place to another. He doesn't have any idea where he is or what's going on. And we as the readers kind of share his perspective to some extent. And that's kind of fun. But that they did sort of leave behind some in giving Arthur, in particular Arthur, right? With Trillian and the romantic subplot, an actual beginning and end to his story. It's not just middle. I mean, it's to say it's a beginning and an end without a middle still suggests that there's still a trajectory, right? But whereas there is not really, it's not really going from one place to another. It's just kind of happening in some places. So I actually think, although the critics are complaining about it, and I get why they do, I think the film has much more narrative shape than any other version of The Hitchhiker's Guide that I know of.
Well, and it's probably a relative thing too, right? So if we're comparing it to the radio series, which just jumps from episode to episode without much explanation or story, that's one thing. But if we're comparing it to like other modern movies made in the mid-aughts, then, it's not the tightly structured, such and such film, like maybe we're used to seeing. So.
And I wonder how much of it's always that thing of what's the complaint, the note behind the note, like the thing that people are really bothered by, but they're, not necessarily articulating up front, of trying to sort of, I want to say graft, but like even very basically put a narrative, thrust and put resolution onto a story that wasn't necessarily originally conceived that way. Maybe by kind of giving Arthur an arc and, fulfillment of some kind at the end and some resolution to his story, it highlights the kind of episodic nature of it that much more. Whereas if people are just sort of enjoying the radio play and not expecting there to be narrative resolution, that might not even occur to them quite as much. But there's a kind of awkward marriage between movie 3-plot structure and, you know, completely episodic random adventures of the radio play. You know, that might be what's kind of rubbing people the wrong way with the film here.
Yeah.
And as I was rewatching the movie, one of the things I tried to do is look at the beginning and see, you know, does the beginning of the movie try to prime audiences to and set expectations? You know, does it prepare audiences and let them know that this is more a series of adventures and not some grand epic science fiction Star Wars adventure? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I thought it was a bit mixed. The beginning with the dolphins I actually love. I think that's brilliant, where the dolphins are, you know, the Broadway musical number and so long, thanks for all the fish. And that kind of starts to prepare audiences, I think, for something a bit quirky and odd and maybe, you know, prime audiences not to maybe take this too seriously or think about it too logically. But that was before the title appears on the screen. And once you get past the title, you have this pretty normal situation for a movie. Guy faces this challenge, friend tries to help him out. So I could understand how some audiences might then think, oh, we're back in a normal movie, we're expecting a fairly cohesive narrative, and then the narrator interjects every once in a while with these quotes from the Hitchhiker's Guide. So I could understand how maybe the movie, it almost feels like the movie didn't commit one way or the other. It could have either committed to a very heavy, well-structured narrative, or it could have really committed to this quirky, odd, episodic non-structure. But it almost took this middle path, which maybe didn't prepare audiences well enough.
Yeah, I think that you're right. There's like this middle path that they took, but I'd say visually, like the bringing the guy to life in the visual way that they did is something. And I don't watch a lot of movies, but for me, that's something that's very different from movies. So even if you have a narrator that interjects every once in now and again, you know, thinking about Princess Bride or something like that, which is a little bit more normal for moviegoers. I think the visual nature of the Hitchhiker's Guide, you know, not just having it in the opening, you know, 5 minutes, but having it come back and keep on showing you those, like hearing the voice, seeing the book, that sort of thing, did kind of pull you back to that quirkiness and kind of, you know, show audiences that this is something a little bit different. That was for me, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that worked to some extent. Although I was also wondering, and again, I'm not sure I've made my own mind up about this, but I noticed that sometimes when the guide interjects, the interjection is quite on point with the plot. It's highly relevant, and it's informing the audience. It's clear exposition, and then at other points it's not, and it seems like a tangent. And I was just kind of curious if that mix works. You know, I noticed, and for one of them, I'm gonna butcher the name of this planet, Vealval 6, where they find Hamakaluva. There surprisingly, I don't think was very much Hitchhikers. If I recall correctly, there wasn't very much Hitchhiker's Guide exposition on that. There was no entry on that planet, even though that's something even book readers might not be as familiar with, which I thought was surprising.
And that whole part is new.
Yeah.
And not only new, but I believe was not Douglas Adams. That was part of Karey Kirkpatrick's adding the middle bit that was missing. Yeah. Which might be like, maybe it's as simple as that. Like they just didn't think like, oh, we should write a new Hitchhiker's Guide entry for this. Because all of the Hitchhiker's Guide entries are pretty much verbatim.
I was just going to say
through
that. Yeah.
all of the versions, I
Absolutely.
believe. At least the ones that we get. I mean, there might be ones that, you know, obviously weren't included in the film.
Yeah, but no, I'm pretty sure that 100% of the things Stephen Fry says in the film are 100% directly from the book.
Yeah.
I mean,
so maybe that was like the line.
But that's all.
Right. Like maybe that was the sort of sacrosanct line they wouldn't cross, right? Like, you know, we can touch the story, we can modify things, we can, you know, change the inflection or change who says certain things, but we're not going to write anything from the actual guide that's not, you know, Douglas Adams like words. At least in one of the versions.
Ironically, the guide can't be revised then.
Right.
And I feel like it could have used more of it. That I think that would have lended some more of the kind of anarchy that you feel of, you know, and maybe some of what's missing when people, when as we're talking about, like, maybe it was a little too structured. Maybe it was a little too like, okay, we're going to only bring in the guide when it's relevant to the story and it's going to give you valuable exposition that you need as a viewer. Like, maybe there could have been a little more, you know, divorce from the necessity of when are we going to bring in the guide. And, you know, because I think when you read the novel, it feels more just ubiquitous, that like it's going to break in at any point to give you completely random things that, you know, that you have to figure out how it's useful or relevant, or even if it is at all.
Yeah. I mean, okay, a couple of things that I was thinking about with this, because we spent a lot of time talking about this in the Mythgard Academy class on the book. And so two things. One, I was kind of interested in the fact, I like the effect, especially the visual effect, you know, Curtis, as you were talking about before, the little graphics that they did in conjunction with the Stephen Fry bits in the film. Because I kind of like the fact that they seem to be creating the overall effect of, you are watching this story, but it's like as if you, the movie viewer, have your copy of the Hitchhiker's Guide, to which you occasionally refer, you know, as things come up in the film. It's not quite like that, because there are many of the ones, some of the sequences aren't linked directly like that, you know, as for instance, inside the narrative, right, when Ford tells Arthur to look up Vogons, right, and he looks up Vogons, and we get the Vogon thing in, you know, on the screen with the graphics and everything in Stephen Fry's voice, right? And then there are other occasions, of course, when the characters are not looking something up in the book. The fact that the characters didn't refer to the book very often at all was one of the things that kind of surprised me, actually. The book played a much smaller role within the narrative itself with the characters than I expected. But the thing that, and this was probably overall, and this is kind of a very, you know, nitpicky thing. Well, I don't know if it's nitpicky, idiosyncratic, perhaps I should say. But the thing that I disliked most about the film, actually, of everything, was what seemed to me merely confused, not an adaptation, not a change, but a mere confusion about the narrative perspective of the book. We spent a lot of time in the Mythgard Academy class talking about this, that the narrator is clearly not the guide, right? And even some of the passages that they included, that was manifestly clear. I like the passage, for instance, that talks about the guide, right? And why it's better selling than, you know, the Encyclopedia Galactica. That just, you can tell from everything that's being said and how it's being said, that is not a quotation from the guide. And so there were a couple instances like that where we're getting what is from the book, directly from the book, but it's the voice of the narrator in the book, which is very clearly different and distinguished from the voice of the, you know, from quotations from the guide itself. And yet they're being kind of, you know, hodgepodged together. And I'm meant to expect, as I was instructed in the opening credits, I was instructed that Stephen Fry was playing the guide, right? So everything Stephen Fry says is meant to be the guide, and it obviously wasn't the guide. And I was ready for that to be, when I saw that in the opening credits, I was like, okay, so they're making a change, right? They're getting rid of the narrator, and they're just going to frame it with a guide, which I think is a perfectly defensible kind of thing to do. But then in the actual product seemed to be kind of a mere confusion, and I'm not sure, it was not obvious to me that they were really thinking about the difference between the narrator and the guide at all. So I found myself sort of confused and sort of disappointed by the way that they engaged with that whole thing.
Yeah, I had the same feeling. I think because having been so sensitive to it, going through
Yeah.
the Academy videos of I don't think that certainly didn't occur to me the first time I saw this movie, but once you go through and you realize that these really are separate characters, it becomes pretty glaring when Stephen Fry is kind of just doing both at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, every time Stephen Fry uses the phrase "Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy," I'm like, "What? It's breaking the frame! I can't handle it! Like, it's not going to be in the Hitchhiker's Guide, is it? It's not. The Hitchhiker's Guide is not going to say, according to the Hitchhiker's Guide, space is." And I'm like, no, just. Anyway, yeah. They should have just. They could have done it. They could have just cut to that, right? When they are popped out of the airlock or fall through the airlock somehow, which I suppose I shouldn't object to, since when spaceships come to a stop, they make tire screeching noises. So why should we object to people falling in space? But in any case, when they fall through,
it's the outrush of the air. They're going with the
right. Clearly, when they fall through the airlock, Stephen Fry could have just said, "Space is really big," right? Just start with the actual quotation from the introduction to the Hitchhiker, instead of telling us that it's from the introduction to the Hitchhiker's Guide. Anyway, but like I say, I don't think that that's necessarily something that would probably bother the majority of film viewers, but I was a little disappointed with how they resolved or failed to resolve that.
Well, they could have especially done that because when we were talking about the visuals, like they had the visuals. So even if they were worried about, maybe the audiences wouldn't get that. Now it's the guy that's talking. Well, they have the visuals. They could have done something, and it would have been very obvious. Yeah.
There's the moment before the whoosh.
Right.
Stop right there.
Right.
I think just without agreeing with everything you just said about the narration and all of that, I think that's a hilarious thing that happens when they fall instead of getting sucked out through the door. Clearly, that they expect to be sucked out.
Yes, that they're staring
at,
at.
Our attention to. To me, that's just one of the funniest moments in the film. At least one of the funniest, like, nonverbal moments in the film. But yeah. But not to just so that everyone could get the visual there. But not to discount the.
Well, that's the kind of joke you can only do in a film, right? Just like the joke that Corey pointed out, the audio jokes about like what song is Marvin playing, in any given scene. Like those are like radio jokes. Right. Like there are certain jokes that are sort of essential to each medium.
Yes. Knock it off, Marvin, and he stops playing Also Sprach Zarathustra in the background. Yeah, exactly.
Right, like that's a radio joke. There's a reason that doesn't make it into the book. So they all kind of come with certain inherent qualities like that.
Well,
and I liked, in that same vein, I like when they, show up in the Heart of Gold and they're transformed into different, like, the kind of claymation, like just those purely visual moments that, I think to me feel like, it communicates that they're thinking about this is a visual medium. How do we adapt this that's in a way different than the novel?
I actually liked those sequences much better in the film than I did in the book, actually. I think the sequences of the description of random stuff happening when they are in the improbability mode are my least favorite parts of the book, actually. I find some of it kind of funny, but I find a lot of it kind of tedious. It was much more interesting. I liked the yarn people way more than I liked any of those scenes in the book, actually.
Yeah, it was really confusing in the book. Reading it, I was a kid, and I was just like, sure, like go with it.
I don't.
Right. And it does make me wonder, like, is that because it was a movie joke? Like Douglas Adams had this in his head. It's like, to him it's funny. He can see what but like there's really only one way to communicate it, and that's visually.
Yeah.
I don't remember which reviewer said it, but like one of the less favorable reviews that I read was lamenting the fact that we don't get to see, Ford Prefect as a penguin. And I'm like, yeah, but you see him as a yarn person. Like, that's so much better.
That's so much better.
And a sofa, like,
And a sofa.
like,
Yeah.
like, I know what a penguin looks like. I don't know what yarn Ford Prefect looks like. I guess, I could figure it out, but yeah, no, I think those are pretty great too. And in the, I don't know if I can't remember if I mentioned this already. I only watched like the first 2 episodes of the TV series, but they actually do there's actually like the overlay of like the leg floating into the sunset, like they describe in the book. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Like, I still prefer the yarn people and, all the couches and whatnot. So the other thing, kind of talking through narrative structure and all that, and we did decide that, I guess, that it does have more of a narrative structure than some of the versions, but maybe not as much as other movies. Okay, that's fine. It's somewhere in the middle. But I was also thinking, like, if you think of like the first, 10, 15 minutes of this film, like how much of it is sort of that fairy tale and induction, I guess, into thinking of like if the galaxy is sort of the perilous realm and Ford Prefect is kind of a elf of some kind that takes Arthur there with the use of a magic ring on his finger, like how much of the things that sort of happen to him are just like these sort of magical things that would happen to anyone else if we were reading this as a fairy story, and all the improbable things that happen in the land of fairy that we're getting here, with just sort of some trappings of a more sci-fi context.
Right.
I think it's a
and there's the link to Doctor Who.
I'm sure there are people who could take that analogy even way further than I just did.
No, I think it's a really good one, actually. And it strikes me that is much more true. I mean, as I was just thinking about it, Curtis, as you were talking, thinking about the story, thinking of Arthur as your fairy tale hero, right? Your fairly typical, normal, like, woodcutter, right? Who, goes into the woods and ends up in fairy, or like Jack and the Beanstalk, right? It does have that kind of structure. I wouldn't have said that. I think if somebody were trying to convince me that the book had that kind of fairy tale structure, I think I would disagree, basically. It's certainly, it gets weird. There is, of course, a sense in which he goes into another world, but it's not the same thing. It doesn't happen. It doesn't really happen in the same way. And to me, one of the things that about the film that makes it more fairy tale like is that he comes back at the end, right, with the second Earth. I think of all the things, that's what I was most surprised by. Like moments where somebody says something in the film when I saw it for the first time and I was like, wait, what? The thing that surprised me most, I think, was when Slarty Bartfast at the end says, we're going to go ahead and make the Earth. And I'm like, what, you are? Really? Okay. And the way that they brought Arthur back to his house at which, so that he returns, the way that they made, and of course this is especially ironic in the Martin Freeman context, how they made Arthur Dent's story into a there and back again story, right? That was, I was surprised by that, and so Curtis, that definitely for me made it feel much more like that kind of fairy tale structure. The fact that he was offered a return to normality again, to use the vocabulary of the improbability drive, right? Making the improbability drive itself a kind of like internal metaphor for Arthur's whole experience, right? He returns to normality at the end, and then of course chooses to reject it, right, and to accept and to embrace the adventurous world that he turned down in the form of Madagascar, with Trillian at the beginning, through his own unwillingness to do that. Anyway, so the way that they showed, even just again the way they showed kind of the progress in Arthur's character, how he becomes this sort of heroic figure, right, with the rescue at Vogsphere and everything else, and then of course his, you know, the alteration, how he chooses not to stay when he's given the chance to come back again at the end of the film. So I think the sort of the, you know, the fairy otherworld story and the way, you know, the way that the human being who is, you know, taken off into fairy and how his life has changed and all that stuff. I think that how that stuff works in the film is, to me, much more striking than in any other adaptation that I can think of. It's again, he goes off in the book, but it's more of a and now for something completely different kind of transition rather than a, you know, human in the land of fairy sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I wrote a rather long paper about this, but you can all go read if you look up the Signum University thesis page on the website. And so in one of the other slides, Curtis quotes Roger Ebert's review where he says, like, it's, you know, this movie is first cousin to Monty Python. So I kind of think, like, if Douglas Adams is related to Monty Python on one side, he's very closely related to Doctor Who on the other. And I felt the Python-ness more in the book, where it's more about to me, like the narration of both the narrator and the guide, and the kind of like wordiness of it, and the kind of jokes and the, you know, cynical little puns and commentaries, to me, are much more closely aligned with, you know, that being the overriding kind of Python sense. Whereas from the film, for me, the Doctor Who-ness came through much more strongly. And I think it is because of that fairy tale structure, that kind of, you know, recursive there and back again, where we, you know, make a journey where we end up where we began, but in a different place because of what you've gone through.
Right.
So, and then there's another thing on that quote about its relationship to Doctor Who in that episodic way that we were talking about, of the series of random adventures. I was reading an essay from this book by Phil Sandifer, his Chartis Eruditorum series, where he writes an essay about the late 70s Doctor Who, but specifically in relation to Hitchhiker's Guide and Fawlty Towers. So he's talking about the relationship between Douglas Adams, Monty Python, and Doctor Who, basically, and kind of saying that the structure of the Hitchhiker's Guide is basically a Doctor Who story, but specifically, you know, Terry Nation was an early writer of the show and kind of was the one to kind of really create this series of capture escape with periods of in between where we rest and we have some exposition and we do this thing and then we go on another adventure and we get captured again and then we talk about it and then we go off over here, and that's just kind of how it goes from episode to episode. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of, Adams has kind of one foot in each of those camps of kind of 70s British culture.
Yeah. And Kat, I mean, you're right. I hadn't been thinking about that. But of course, when you were talking about the parallel there, the parallel between Arthur in the film in particular and the Doctor's companions is pretty strong, right? You know, the way in which his perspective is changed by being taken off and shown the wonders of the universe really does make, I mean, he's no Sarah Jane Smith, but, you know, he's in that position, right? And that parallel does seem pretty striking. Tony Mead was asking, then who's the Doctor? You know, if Arthur's the companion, because that of course is one of the major differences, right? Is that there is no Doctor figure exactly, and what effect does that have on the story, right? You know, to have a story where the structure is similar, but you have a companion, but you have no Doctor, or in the place of a Doctor, we have this, you know, just couple of crazy people who don't really know what they're doing at all, even crazier than the Doctor, right? With even less of an idea of what they're doing than the Doctor.
The one, and I'm not an expert on fairy tale structure, so feel free to push back on this, but one possible difference I see, and less so in the film than in the book, is that this feels much more like a story of, because the framing device and because the Hitchhiker's Guide, of placing the audience in this crazy galaxy of the Hitchhiker's Guide and then bringing Arthur Dent into that galaxy, rather than starting in the mundane world with Arthur Dent and going to the perilous realm with him. And throughout the story, we actually, as the reader or as the viewer, know much more than Arthur Dent. And my understanding is in a lot of fairy tales, usually the reader or the viewer learns about the world along with the protagonist, along with the person who's been transported in the fairy. And here it's like we know a lot more, even as Arthur Dent learns, we learn exponentially more than he does. So that seems to be one difference that might complicate this bit.
Right. Well, and there, of course, the guide itself, the Stephen Fry, voiceover, is the biggest difference, right? I mean, from the very beginning, from the dolphin sequence at the beginning, right? The film opens with sort of pulling back the curtain on a perspective on the world that most humans don't have, in which Arthur... So we begin by knowing that humans are the third most intelligent species on planet Earth, which puts us in looking at things from a totally different perspective, or rather at least hinting at a totally different perspective than Arthur has. So you're absolutely right, Dominic, and both about the observation about fairy tale structure, that yes, generally we are walking alongside the human protagonist of the story and finding things wonderful and marvelous as the protagonist is finding them. And so, but it's the guide, I would say. It's the guide that really puts us... the scene when Ford gives Arthur the book for the first time and starts showing him stuff, or, letting him look things up. It's almost like we get the feeling of
Been there, done that.
Yeah, of Arthur's slowly catching up to us, right? Yeah. He's now finally getting access. He's several steps behind. And even, of course, what happens immediately after that? What happens immediately after that is the Babelfish, right? Mm-hmm. And Ford trying to shove the Babelfish in his ear. And while Arthur is kicking and screaming, like a bad pediatric patient, while Ford is trying to jam the fish in his ear, we're hearing the voiceover explaining what the Babelfish is, right? So we, we know all about this, whereas Arthur is just ignorantly kicking up a fuss, right? Not wanting to get the fish shoved in his ear. So I'm just thinking of that, Dominic, as another example of exactly what you're describing, of that gap in understanding between us and Arthur, where Arthur is so much further behind.
So I had shown this slide briefly before, but I did want to talk. So I mean, we talked a little bit about some of the visual cues and changes, but just a couple other things. And we don't have to stick specifically to the scenes that I have depicted here, but besides sort of the yarn people and the improbability stuff and sort of the visual humor from the airlock scene or any others, were there any other sort of striking moments? These were ones, obviously, for me. The depiction of Zaphod Beeblebrox. I know a lot of people, again, ones who were more familiar with maybe the television series or whatever, didn't like the way the heads came kind of up and down instead of were side to side. Also, I liked that. I thought it was clever, and I thought it worked pretty well, actually. And also for the scene of the destruction of the Earth, where it's kind of just the and then it's gone, more than a explosion, planet Death Star exploding type of thing. That felt to me more true to the source material than
Yes.
than any other kind of thing that maybe could have been done there. But yeah, I mean, these were just starting points. Any other particular, like from a visual perspective, whether it's a reference to the original story or a completely new thing that you guys enjoyed, disliked, or whatever.
In that same vein too, I don't know that we have a slide specifically about like performances, but I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts on that, because I know that some of these performances are better received than others. So I'm curious, why might that be? You know, what is it that certain people are tapping into that works really well, and others might not be quite getting the vibe right?
I remember when I
There's a quote about performance for you.
Oh, there you go. Oh, right. Yeah, Malkovich.
I remember Marvin being really striking to me as a robot. We like the image of a robot that people think of is still like the square head and the square body and everything like that. And he's got this big bulbous head, and I think that that's kind of striking. And you pair that with the actor voice, which I'm failing on remembering right now.
Alan Rickman.
Alan Rickman. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. That I didn't know that, but yeah, it's just so good. And so visually, you have this this robot with such a big personality, GPP, and you have Alan Rickman behind it, and I just thought it was just fantastically done for me. Really
and it kind of forces him to walk like this. Yes. Like there's like that head must be like heavy. It like makes him kind of shuffle around. And
I feel like the hanging your head when you just feel so down. Like you imagine it just being pulled to the ground with that sort of weight of the head.
And at the same time, he walks like a 4-year-old, right? You know, I mean, he looked adorable. Like it evokes the body language of a child, right? Which, to me, that really changed my relationship with Marvin, right? And I noticed, by the way, that the other characters were much less harsh with Marvin than they were in the book. I mean, there was a certain amount of eye rolling, right, and a few comments, but nothing like as harsh as in the book. Yeah, I did. I wasn't okay. This feels almost like blasphemous to say, but I didn't like Alan Rickman as Marvin. I mean, you can't say you don't like Alan Rickman, right? But it's not. So I will try to recover that comment merely by saying he's too good for Marvin. Like, his voice is too interesting. Marvin needed to have a duller voice. Like, I wanted more, yes, don't talk to me about life. Like, Alan Rickman could not do a colorless tone of voice. Like, his voice is incapable of doing colorless, right? It can be many things, but not just a drone, which is what Marvin, I think, should kind of sound like, you know, just kind of droning on. And I mean, we're talking about the robot who bored another computer so badly that it committed suicide, right? And it's like, who would ever commit suicide listening to Alan Rickman? I mean, if you're listening to Alan Rickman, you'd be like, no, go on forever. I can take it, right?
Well, but not in this version. That doesn't happen.
Right, exactly.
And I don't know, maybe with the whole point of view gun thing, I mean, does Alan Rickman's voice in the head of a Vogon? I don't know. Maybe that's maybe that's really what we should be asking ourselves, because that entire thing is just here. Like, that doesn't happen
right.
in any other version.
Yeah.
Two quick things about the performance.
That was clearly the equivalent, right? You know, the shooting of the Vogons with the point of view gun was the sort of plot stand-in for the computer committing suicide.
Yep.
There's actually a bit of interesting behind-the-scenes stuff about Marvin, in that Warwick Davis, the same actor who played Wicket, the Ewok in Return of the Jedi, did the body performance for Marvin, but Alan Rickman provided the voice. And apparently Warwick Davis has complained about this, and he said that he wasn't really given much direction as Marvin, and that he didn't coordinate with Alan Rickman to know what was going on in the scene and what the voiceover would sound like. So apparently there were some communication issues between the two.
Yeah.
Mike Moore in the chat is agreeing with you, Corey. He's calling Marvin faintly bitchy, which is not exactly. It's in the ballpark, but it's not an exact match for what
not an exact match. Yeah.
Actually depressed.
Yes.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to say about the robot is, if you're looking for the more boxy robot Marvin that maybe would be expected, the one from the TV series is actually an Easter egg in the scene where they're on the Vogon planet, and Arthur Dent knows how to queue, right? And so he gets in the queue. The boxy robot in the queue there with him is the robot from the original TV series.
Oh, cool.
So if you want to compare, yeah,
that's cool.
So speaking of that, Arthur's British and he knows how to queue. How about having most of the other main characters be American? I mean, it certainly makes Arthur's Britishness much more a characteristic of him and less so of the entire population of the galaxy that he's meeting.
Having Zaphod be American, I thought was a brilliant choice. Just having the dumb, over the top American. I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I think anything said in a British accent sounds 10 times smarter than anything said in an American accent. So I just don't think that character would have worked as well with a Tony Blair accent. So good job for that one.
And I read in somewhere in the research for all this, that basically Sam Rockwell took Clinton, George W., and Elvis as his three people he was trying to emulate on screen there, mashing them all together. And I mean, it worked really well. I also read somewhere that the only character that Douglas Adams demanded be British, which makes sense, is Arthur, and that he thought that it would be fine to have. Now, whether they needed to all be American is a different question. Maybe there could have been a little more diversity there, nationality, culturally, ethnically, all of that. But at least the Britishness of Arthur Dent was never questioned, and from there, even he apparently felt like it was okay to mix and match a bit. Personally, I think Mos Def as Ford Prefect works really well sometimes, and then just other times it's very uneven.
Yes.
I feel like, especially his pronunciation of Bogans, right? The Bogans. It's all right, Ford. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I agree. Uneven, I thought, that's a good description of Ford.
I mean, again, my favorite ones are maybe the little bit more slapsticky type stuff, or more physical comedy, like the trying to greet the car rushing at him, or even here, the sort of very slow, just putting his hand on the shoulder, and or even when he hugs Arthur, trying to reassure him, and it's just that quick, okay, I reassured you, now we're done. Those types of things I thought worked really well if I'm trying to think about what I liked about the performance. And then, anytime he was just sort of trying to explain information or give away, and it's hard to say if that's performance or script or whatever, maybe there's just, it wasn't written well or whatever. I think in my view, as far as Ford Prefect goes, there was some really good moments and some, ones that didn't work quite as well.
Well, I've promised Arthur, who's here tonight and who wanted me to talk about this in the class, that we'd talk about it tonight, and he's been bringing it up, and I want to make sure we do it. Trillian.
Shocking.
Arthur objects to Trillian quite strongly. He thinks that he's in the comments he's been calling Trillian the Faramir of this film, in that she's the one that he feels has been done most wrong in this depiction. And the argument is, so he was emphasizing how, in the book, for instance, that phrase, and we talked about this a little bit, how Adams uses the phrase devastatingly brilliant, right? Beginning with a phrase that sounds like he's going to talk about her physical attraction, right? I mean, but then instead he's talking about her mind, as a way of kind of undermining that. Arthur was talking about how in the original TV series, Trillian is generally scantily dressed, so they go with this sort of eye candy sort of look for her, but she still is brainy and intelligent, and whereas Arthur was suggesting he thought in this film they really kind of dumbed her down and just made her into the romantic interest, which brings out the best in Arthur rather than being a substantial and strong character on her own. What do you guys think of that? What kind of reactions did you guys have to Trillian in particular? And do you think, do you agree with Arthur that she's been done wrong and been taken sort of knocked a few steps back the path of feminism here in this film, or what?
I do agree. I think it could have been a lot worse. But I think they did do damage. She's sort of in this film, she's sort of more wanderlust than anything else.
Yeah.
Which is fine, but when you take a character that is so brilliant and can command a ship and drive a ship, and kind of, I think her agency is a little bit stripped away, and she's kind of portrayed as this woman who chose the wrong guy, and now she's on a ship with him, and what do I do? As opposed to someone who is a little bit more regretful in the book, and one that actually, she's the one who pushes the improbability drive, right, when they're falling to Megathria, and in the film it's Arthur, correct?
Yeah, actually, it's Arthur in the book too.
It's Arthur in the book too. Yeah, okay.
It is Arthur in the book too.
Okay, so I had that wrong, but there is this other moments that in the book she kind of demonstrates how intelligent she is, and I don't think you got that in the film, unfortunately. And I thought that Zooey Deschanel's performance kind of fell a little flat for me as well. Certainly when you're across Martin Freeman, it's very difficult because he's such a stellar actor. But it fell a little flat for me.
I agree, but I also think a lot of it is a consequence of what we were talking about before, where the writers tried to impose more of a narrative structure. And once you decide to give Arthur Dent a clear narrative arc, a clear arc in this movie, well, what are you going to do? It means that you have to give Arthur more agency, and probably take that away from other characters. And they probably could have come up with something more interesting and more original than he has to go save the princess. But that is kind of a typical go-to Hollywood formula for narrative. So I kind of suspect Trillian's character is sacrificed on the altar of this narrative push more than anything else.
I just think if this movie was made today, it would be different. I like to think that, and I do think that to a certain extent, a lot of it would be different. But I think that they wouldn't have made maybe the same mistakes they did with Trillian's character in 2018.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, she is like the changes that they make. Kelly, I really agree with what you're saying, and as Mike is saying in the comments here, he said they celebrate her quirkiness instead of her competence, and I agree. I think that's also true. But at the same time, of course, she doesn't get much stage time in the book. I mean, she vanishes for long periods. She's the most minor she's irrelevant to so much of what happens in the story. And especially once they get to Magrathea, she's along for the ride. Does she contribute one single original? I mean, she makes some comments sometimes, usually cutting comments to Zaphod, but so it's not like she has no dialogue. But I don't think she contributes anything independent to the action at any point from when they arrive at Magrathea onwards. She's just kind of along. So although conceptually she is, very intelligent and very competent, all that stuff, and I agree that's all true, she's almost a cipher as far as the story is concerned for much of the book. Whereas here, yes, it's true, she's made, curious but not intelligent. She's made the object of action instead of the doer of action, and yet she's a central element of the story, which she was not a central element of the story, so I to some extent it's kind of interesting, and Kelly, I think, maybe it comes back to what you were saying about sort of they chose to do something with her character, right? It's just the question of what exactly it was that they chose to do. And what they chose to do was to make her, as Arthur was suggesting also, just a fairly stereotypical love interest, basically.
Yeah, it's a sort of same pitfall that the Hobbit movies did when you have the elf, and sure, now you have a female character that can shoot arrows, great, but she falls into just being the love interest. So we have a woman on screen, yay, but not done in the way that really she deserves.
And you also had that very odd romance between her and Zaphod, and then her and Arthur, and the whole point of view gun subplot, and how they hid the destruction of Earth from her, and then she was emotionally devastated. Then she, for some reason, jumps into Arthur's arms at the end. Again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about the narrative, where they wanted to impose more of a narrative structure, but they didn't really commit to it. So it's like, we didn't really get a well-developed love story. And I think in the book, if I'm not mistaken, Trillian by the end is like, yeah, I don't really want either of you guys, I'm going to go do my own thing, which kind of seems like a more natural conclusion given what she's been through. I'm kind of wondering, maybe we don't have to take this up, but if this were made today and we were adapting this, should Ford Prefect have been a female character? If we wanted to introduce more female characters into the movie and do something different. I'm just wondering, is there any reason he has to be a male, and might that have changed up the dynamic in some interesting ways?
Well, what wasn't just, and I don't, it's kind of goes off of your question but doesn't answer it. They did kind of create, the Deep Thought was a female voice.
Right.
Yeah.
And so were the two mice.
The mice, yeah.
Then they had that vice president who is another. It turns out her whole character arc was love interest. She fell in love with Zaphod, and
this bizarre obsession with Zaphod. She was like a stalker. Yeah, it was weird.
Yeah.
Well, right, and that was completely unnecessary. It was now that Trillian is, not an option for Zaphod because she chose Arthur, we need some other woman to kind of step into play. And it's it would have been much more interesting if, and I can't think of even the character's name, but the vice president there was just like, it's my duty to go after, and I command this fleet of Vogons, and I'm like the second in command in the galaxy, going after Zaphod because he stole, this ship. And that's the thing she does. She's a smart and capable, commander of the army, and not, I'm chasing after him because, he's attractive and whatever. It could have been a very different subplot.
It
would have didn't need to be what it was.
Yeah, I agree. If anything, to me, from that sort of a representation of women as almost exclusively sexual objects, that subplot, the vice president subplot, I found more offensive than what they did with Trillian. What they did with Trillian was kind of more of a violation in that way, more of a deviation from the other versions of Trillian that we've seen. But yeah, that one I had a really hard time with the vice president character. The one thing that I will say, I mean, you know, I was just looking at the image of Trillian that you have up there, Curtis. I will give them props at least for not having Trillian emphatically non-scantily clad all the way through the film. Or, you know, even like at the beginning where she's wearing the shorts and goes and puts something on, right? You know, she's almost scantily clad. It's not even all that scanty by film standards, right? But then she immediately goes and puts on more clothes and wears them for the whole rest of the film, right? That was it. We do get the shower scene, I know, but still, by and large, it was given the fact that she was transformed into this, you know, romantic and sexual object, I was slightly surprised that she was not more visually sexualized during the course of the film.
But even that, I remember thinking the second time through watching this, like why is she that bothered? I mean, she has shorts and they're short shorts, but it's not like you said, like it's not like she's walking around in underwear or something, or you know what, like why is she that concerned because Arthur's there? Like without the whole romantic subplot, it just seemed like a
casual versus like uniform.
Maybe
like for me, I saw that as kind of like a cute moment of her being like, whoa, he's here. Oh my gosh, I'm like in my pajamas, which is really funny because he's in his pajamas the whole time.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
One thing I wanted to mention too, and actually had a brief Twitter exchange right before we were signing on. As far as visual depictions go, there are no digital watches in here.
Yes.
But one thing that I did see and did notice is that right in the beginning, it's like the rest of the movie, it's inconsistent. He does spend a lot of time looking at his phone. And so it seems like almost maybe that could have been a stand-in for the whole digital watch thing, which is interesting because I stumbled across it was at some point, I think when Douglas Adams was corresponding with the U.S. editor of the U.S. version of one of the books. I don't even know if it was the original one. And the editor had changed references of digital watches to cell phones. This was like in the early 90s. And Douglas Adams was like, no, we're not doing that. We're keeping it with digital watches. It's still relevant and whatever. And I mean, this is, you know, the early 2000s here. Like we're not, it's before, you know, the Facebook and all the smartphone craze that we have now of, you know, constantly staring at your screen. At this point, it was only like 75% staring at your screen all the time. But yeah, just that's one thing I noticed. I did try to find a scene specifically, but like his robe covers his hand so much. There's one moment though, like right in the very beginning, before he actually puts his robe on, when he's like rubbing his face, and you can see he doesn't have any digital watches that he's wearing there. So minor point, but just thought I'd mention.
Especially in the context though of with the Hitchhiker's Guide, right? With the Hitchhiker's Guide as, and I know this was also kind of brought up in the context of that Twitter exchange you were having, Curtis, that the way that our view of the Hitchhiker's Guide is kind of necessarily sort of informed in the context of looking things up on your smartphone in your pocket, right? And how that kind of changes the whole context of having the Hitchhiker's Guide. Seeing Arthur shift from his cell phone at the beginning to the Hitchhiker's Guide after he goes, right? You know, it creates this interesting new dynamic, right? Because it's like an upgrade, which is not how it is in the book, right? Because we don't have that context. So instead of being taken to a completely new and unrecognizable world, it's like, and here's an even this is even better than your cell phone, right? But it's still kind of in the same ballpark, right? It's still the same sort of category. Yeah.
I think this issue.
So to what extent? Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I think the phone issue actually touches upon another point I wanted to make about the film, and that it doesn't feel as outdated as I thought it would be for a film that's almost 15 years old. Relies on a lot of special effects. Most of the effects held up all right. I watched this on a 65-inch 4K TV, and I'm usually very sensitive to effects. I thought the Vogon costumes look phenomenal. I could tell Zaphod's head was fake in a few scenes, but just switching it to phones, I think, helped in that sense. If it had been digital watches, the film would have come across as much more dated. So no, it's to the film's credit that at least visually in a lot of ways it holds up.
When we went back and started our initial watch of and rewatch of Buffy, and it's beat me if the apocalypse comes. It's like,
yes,
that's far enough back that it makes it's like not till like season 4 or 5 that they actually have like flip phones and
right,
can text each other or whatever. I agree. Like the effects I think are generally really good, especially like you said, considering that the film's almost 15 years old or whatever. I like that sustained, choppy, but like intentionally so pullback from the earth, out like and giving you that grandiose scale of where they're about to head into.
Visually, that sequence was my favorite. The whole from the Vogon fleet arriving, slightly disappointed that the Vogon constructor ships were not yellow. That doesn't seem too much to ask, right? But whatever. Like I apart from the lack of yellowness, I loved that whole sequence and the backing off, and then the Curtis, as you were pointing out before, the sort of anticlimactic and really sort of surprisingly non-cinematic implosion of the earth rather than a nice, theatrical explosion, right? You think, like, come on, this is the mother of all explosions, right? You get to do a really big one and blow up a whole planet, but no, it's just zap and it's gone. I loved that. I thought that worked really, really well.
Another thing I really liked about that scene too is that the visuals really work well in conjunction with the story in emphasizing the humor. It's not just that it pulls back, and it's not that it's a choppy pullback. The music plays goes dun 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 and tries to build up tension, but it doesn't release the tension right away. It repeats that theme several more times.
Yes.
So it has a comical effect as well, which is great. And that's when the film combines the music and the visuals and comedy, that's really when it's on all 4 cylinders.
Yeah.
And instead of the yellow parallel, you get their ships, to me, look like these awful cinder blocky high-rise office buildings. These kind of tall rectangles that look kind of what you lose in the one comparison, it gets into like the bureaucracy of the Vogons and how they're like even their costumes with the kind of dingy suit and tie and everything. It still kind of gets at the same idea.
I love too that the people actually put bags over their heads and lay down on the floor. I don't think in any other version we actually see that they do that. Like it's just suggested, like, should we do this? Well, if you think it'll help, that's fine. But here we actually see they do it. That to me, I laugh at that every time. And I did want to definitely talk about the humor in general. I know we've talked about bits and pieces here and there. I kind of split this out. So there's that visual humor there. On the top left are just a few of the obvious, lines that get pulled in that are always funny in every version. And they're in every version, I'm pretty sure. On the bottom right, I kind of threw in some ones that I believe are unique to this one, to the film itself. And then, Dom, you had shared just with the panelists here a video comparing some of the things, and the person who made that video was very upset by all the changes. And one of the things particularly that he pointed out that I thought was worth talking about was what he called the cringe humor, the Office type humor of where you have Martin Freeman, who of course starred in the UK version of The Office, sort of saying, "I said all these people are idiots," right when the music cuts out and everyone can hear him, and it's not. It's not humorous in the way that's sort of like the clever Douglas Adams humor. And I think this is one of the types of things that people point to when they say Douglas Adams never would have liked this. I would like to see evidence that he wouldn't have liked that type of humor, I guess, because we don't really have evidence to that before I would, agree with that. But just this sort of to represent some of the different funny lines, moments, visual things, different types of humor, slapstick stuff, the Zaphod hitting himself with all three of his arms, I laugh at. Maybe others don't, but I think that's funny. Any thoughts there about like other, and we can, if there are other visual things too, if whether they tie into humor or not, we can keep talking about other stuff too. I just wanted to throw in there because you had mentioned the humor aspect of it. So I wanted to make sure we talked about all the different types of humor in the film too.
Well, the flip side of my... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So the flip side of the comment that I just made about the visuals and the music and everything in the movie supporting the humor is that sometimes they didn't. And sometimes it felt like the narrative was in tension with the humor. And in particular, I felt like the Slarty Bartfast introduction didn't quite work as well for me. In that scene, Slarty Bartfast is talking and then reveals his name and says, the actor basically says, "My name is Slarty Bartfast." And during that scene, the music is playing in the background just as it would normally in any other movie. There's no build up. It's not the actor doesn't build it up. And it doesn't hit you as much as even Corey's reading in one of the classes we did. There's no "My name is dun dun," Slarty Bartfast, and the music doesn't push that. And I thought that was disappointing. And there are a few other times in the movie where it just felt like this was a line said in a normal movie, produced in a way that any other movie would be produced, rather than finding ways to push the music and push the visuals to emphasize the humor and really do something unique with it.
Yeah.
Well, and even the fact that he does kind of, in a way, for me, overbuild it up in that he doesn't want to say what the name, like he resists for several moments of not wanting to say what his name is, which to me kind of undercuts the humor because you're kind of telling people, okay, there's a joke coming. Like, here, get ready for the punchline. And then it's not as good as, like, it's underwhelming. Rather than, I think when you read it, this name just comes out of left field and surprises you and catches you a little bit more off guard.
So, Curtis, I've been looking it up because I was pretty sure I remembered an example of Adams using exactly that kind of cringe humor in the book. Good. And I thought of, and I checked, and I'm right. It's actually very similar. It's the introduction of Trillion's character when Trillion and Arthur meet for the first time. He hasn't seen Trillion yet. He doesn't know that she's in the room and can hear him, and he's talking about her because he meets Zaphod and says how he's met Zaphod before, and he's just recounted his encounter with Trillion. Saying, "Oh, beautiful, charming, devastatingly intelligent. At last I'd got her to myself for a bit and was plying her with a bit of talk when this friend of yours barges up and says, 'Hey, doll, is this guy boring you?' And then she cuts in with, 'But you must admit he did turn out to be from another planet,' and now he's all embarrassed because he's just been talking about her and he didn't realize she was in the room. It's not the same thing as the 'I said all these people are idiots' scene, but it's in the same category, I think."
Yeah.
The one thing about the all these people are idiots scene that doesn't quite work is the Office style cringe humor works when I think it works at least when we care about the person's relationship with the other people in the audience, the recipients of that cringeworthy comment. And in this case, we don't. Trillian and Arthur are the only people we care about in that scene. We don't even know who any of those other party guests are. They never come up, and so. And yeah, there's some inherent embarrassment when you say, if you say something like that at a party and other people overhear you, but it's not as powerful as, say, somebody in an office with his coworkers saying something bad about the coworkers and knowing that he'll have to interact with them every day and have to live down that embarrassing situation.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I mean, another comment that I think I saw a number of people who were critical about the humor is the slapstick, more type of slapstick stuff, which by nature is visual. Like you can't really do slapstick in I mean, you could try to do it in a book, but it wouldn't work that well. Maybe you could have some funny sounds in a radio play, but it's not the same thing. But I mean, if Monty Python is a second cousin here. I mean, they literally do a sketch where they're just slapping each other with fish, and people are laughing at it. So, like, I don't think that that's terribly just in the broader realm of like English humor and stuff. I don't think that's outside of the sort of things that maybe would be enjoyable to Douglas Adams.
Those little face slappy things on Vogsphere. Right, that come up out of the sand and smack them in the face.
That's one of the things a lot of people don't like, apparently.
See, I didn't like it at first either, and then they kept at it, and I kept liking it worse. But they kept at it for so long, I liked it again by the end. Like I was like, okay, that's kind of and they're going to keep going. All right, this is getting less and less funny. But by the end, I loved it. They persevered just long enough.
Like when they're running and literally they're getting slapped left and right.
Right. Well, it's after they come out, right? That last time when they've saved Trillian and they come out and Arthur says, "I have no idea," and get smacked in the face again. I was like, okay, it's all worth it now. That was enough.
So that's the problem with Jar Jar Binks. We didn't have enough Jar Jar Binks in the Phantom Menace.
More. Oh God.
I don't think that one was a problem that would be solved by quantity, but yeah.
That's an interesting theory. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's. I think it's funny, because it's clearly not like the things aren't triggered by having an idea. It's by stating that you have an idea, or that some kind of. It's like you can have all the ideas you want, just don't tell people about them, and everything will be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh well, I do. So speaking of comedy and comic effect, I was disappointed in the Vogon poetry. First of all, like they talked over the Vogon poetry, and I'm like, come on, we got like half a line of Vogon poetry, and then Stephen Fry cuts over it, and we're just kind of can barely hear it in the background. I was glad that we did get "See If I Don't" at the end, which is my favorite line of the Vogon poem, but it doesn't have the same effect if you don't build up to it the way that the poem does. I guess I was kind of confused by the Vogon poetry thing, because on the one hand, they made a kind of bigger deal of it than I was almost expecting them to, really. I mean, not only we had the setup in advance about not listening to the, but we did the whole Vogon poetry is the third worst poetry in the universe thing from the from Stephen Fry. We had this whole scene with like the shaft and all the audience and the microphone descending down. I mean, it was like this big dramatic buildup. But we didn't get poetry appreciation chairs, right? We didn't get the kinds of reactions. Arthur just looked vaguely confused the whole time that the Vogon poetry was being read to them. And so that it was, I felt like it was this, to me, this bizarre kind of combination of, on the one hand, they like you could say they did full justice to the scene. I mean, they did the whole thing, but at the same time, it was as if they weren't really committed to it, you know? Like, they're not going to really do the poem. We're not going to get the poetry appreciation chairs. You know, we're not going to show the physical effect. I mean, the thing that makes me laugh more than anything else in the book account is the way in which the recitation of the poem is interrupted by, like, screams and groans from Arthur and Ford. That's really good. I mean, it's because of course, I mean, I'm sitting here listening to the poem, right, and I'm like, okay, this is not a very good poem, but you know, I'm not about to start writhing and shrieking and gasping, you know, and so hearing their exaggerated reaction just cracks me up every single time. So. Anyway, I thought it was sort of slightly peculiar the way that they end up sort of being a little half-hearted on the Vogon poetry front.
Yeah, the joke doesn't quite land the same, does it?
No, it really doesn't. I don't know if they were afraid of the joke. In some sense, like that it wouldn't be funny, like to amplify the metaphors and you know, like what the poetry appreciation chair was meant to be doing, right? And that was going to be torture. I don't know. Like I have a hard time figuring out why they went to the lengths that they did and yet kind of pulled back from it.
I wonder if it's just that they didn't think they could make that effect up. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying the thing that you pointed out in the Academy series about how one of the funniest things about the poetry is that it's not actually like worse than it is.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I'm crit-ficking, but I'm wondering if like they were kind of sensitive to that. If we just have them read it, what if it's not funny? What if the audience doesn't get that this is bad and thinks it's stupid that they're writhing and screaming? And so we'll kind of cover it up, and like, if you don't hear it, you don't have to hear how kind of mediocre it is.
The fear lest the audience not understand the fact that it's bad poetry, yeah, or like that they not perceive the badness of the poetry. Yeah, that's
well, like what if they had taken it almost like the like Andy Kaufman reading The Great Gatsby, kind of like just very straightforward, like without all of the, you know, because like I feel like. Because you get the Vogon, like the inflection and like all of that, you know. Like, what if he had just read it like as dryly and like matter of factly as he could have, and then I mean, yeah, Ford kind of rides around a little bit, but yeah, I agree with you. Like Martin Freeman just kind of stands there looking like, what's going on here?
Yeah,
and you don't get the sense that there's any kind of physical agony from just hearing the words coming out of his mouth.
And my guess is that he's meant to be the audience standing there they're expecting the audience to hear the poetry and just kind of go, huh? Like, do we get it? And whereas maybe they would have needed Arthur to also just completely commit to the absolute torture that he's going through.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think at a cutting back and forth, you know, Curtis, just as you're suggesting, I would have had the Vogon deliver the poem, right, in like a really deep, serious poetry recitation voice, right? Like he's taking himself completely seriously, like this is and personally, I would have tried to toy with to hope that the audience would make the mistake of like kind of thinking like, or at least be asking themselves, wait, is this a good poem or a bad? Is this supposed to be good or bad, right? I would love it if the audience were asking themselves that. And then you cut to a picture of Ford and Arthur, like, you know, like writhing and screaming. I would have had like blood coming out of their ears and like, you know, just like the cut to the torment and the horror of their reaction. That would have been really funny. Oh, well.
I actually had a similar reaction to Corey, but the fly swatters on the Vogon homeworld initially, and I ended up liking them as well, but for a different reason. It was really when I took a step back and thought, where are we? We're on the Vogon homeworld, the homeworld of bureaucrats, and you have something that hits you whenever you have an independent thought. I just love that irony.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was intentional, but that was just that worked really well.
I'm sure it was, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. I conceptually I liked it. Yeah, I did. I like the fact that they had the jeweled crabs.
Yep.
I wasn't sure whether I liked the fact that when their escape pod landed and the door opened, they crushed a crab like one of the Vogons. You know, the way that kind of put them into the position of the Vogons.
Sure.
I wasn't sure about that. I'm kind of still thinking about that. You know, with the fate of the jeweled crab there, but.
I know one of the jokes that gets maligned a lot too is the very ending with, sorry to tell you, but the restaurant at the end of the universe is at the other end of the universe. And of course the end of the universe is actually time, not space. In the book, and a lot of people. So I have to wonder, like I can't believe that the people doing this movie didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Like I almost feel like that's a joke on the people who are taking the line too literally, as oh, that's not funny because you're getting it all wrong, but maybe they got it exactly right, and that's the joke, is that we know it's not at the other end of the physical universe, spatially, it's at the other end of time. I don't know. I laugh at it every time it comes up.
I agree with you. That can't be just them screwing it up. I mean, that absolutely can't be. So yeah, I like the idea of them sort of playing with it. I mean, on the one hand, of course, the idea that the restaurant at the end of the universe is at the end of time is sort of a joke they don't have time to develop, right? They can't sort of spring that particular comedic trap in the context of the story, so they sort of make something else of it. But which is how I read it, the first time I saw that, that they were just like, okay, they're just kind of shifting the joke because they wanted to make a joke out of it, but they couldn't make the original joke, so they made a different and kind of lesser one, but okay. But Curtis, I love the idea that they're actively screwing with the people who would be offended by that. That's kind of fun, actually. Yeah, I like it.
So this might be blasphemy, but one joke that did not work for me in the film, that worked all right for me in the book, was the whale joke when the whale was falling. Yeah. Because seeing a whale fall to its death felt very different than just reading about it. When I saw that scene in this rewatch, I was like, maybe I've been watching BBC's Blue Planet recently, and the last episode had some sperm whales, so maybe I've just been sensitized. But I felt the sense of dread for this poor whale. And again, it's just not something I felt in the book, but when you see it on film and you hear the whale, it's like, that didn't work well for me.
For me, in the book, you have the whale's carcass.
Right.
And that's much more I had totally the opposite reaction. I thought it was way funnier to watch the whale die. But you have the voice actor actually was in Black Books. He's really funny, and so I really liked hearing that, and then not seeing the actual, the carcass of the whale, and in the book that I definitely felt very, more upset and I felt more empathetic to the whale in the book than I did in the film. Interestingly, I know.
It is interesting,
and that's funny because I feel like I'm in the exact middle of. To me, that's one of the ones where my experience of the movie moment was almost identical to the book moment. To me, that was a very faithful, close representation of the mixed kind of, philosophy, what kind of deep, dark themes are we getting at here with just the kind of splatter comedy of it. And I agree, maybe it works because it is such a, it's just a monologue. As long as you get someone to do that monologue justice, the humor is going to come through, and the actor did a really good job of conveying that.
Yeah, I will say an even more blasphemous thing, which is that that's probably my least favorite joke in the book. Like, I mean, it's funny. It's not that I don't acknowledge that it's funny, but maybe it's because I feel too strongly for the whale and him dreading what's good that I don't handle the sort of the comedy value of it, while like combined with the dread of its incipient death of which it's ignorant. You know, the way the dramatic irony plays off of the comedy there is perhaps too much for me. But the primary thing for me that where I agreed, I was not a fan of that scene, how it came off in the film. But the reason for me, it's true that the actual, in a sense, the puff of snow that comes up when the whale lands was almost like more graphic than the verbal description of the chunks of whale meat that were lying around afterwards. But anyway, the thing that bothered me is seeing an actual whale on screen, or like at least a digital whale or whatever, seeing a whale on screen, there was more of a disconnect between the picture and the voice, I felt, because the voice is really animated, right? But of course the whale is just perfectly impassive while it's falling. It wasn't even thrashing its tail about or anything, right? So it was hard for me to connect, seeing the picture of the whale, it was hard for me to connect the voice that I'm hearing with the whale that I'm seeing. Whereas I can build that imaginative link in the book, which of course makes it much more painful. But or in the radio drama, where again I'm imagining the whale, but I'm just listening to it.
Well, it's like in a similar way, they kind of put a voice for dolphins. You know, dolphins and whales, like the song "So Long and Thanks for All the Fish." Whereas you see them in the beginning, and of course they don't have any voices that we can hear, but this song is playing, and so but it's like their song that they made, which is a very animated, very musical number. So I think that'd be an interesting thing to compare.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're coming up right here on the 2-hour mark, and I know we got some feedback that some of our listeners might like to not listen longer than that. So it wasn't quite put exactly that way. I think it was, you should stick to the advertised time frame of your sessions. I want to.
That's good.
I don't think Corey ever gets this feedback, right?
That's what I'm all about, though. It's because I'm so scrupulous about it. That's why people are spoiled, because they're used to me ending right on time all the time, so they can't handle it.
We were just following in the grand Mythgard tradition.
Exactly.
But I did want to bring up the two very minor bits of cultural impact that I could tie directly to the movie. That weren't based on other iterations of the Hitchhiker's Guide. Of course, there are many, right? Even my 13-year-old daughter, who had never read the book, seen the movie, or anything, knew the answer to the question of life, universe, and everything. She had no idea where that came from, or whatever, but she knew it when I asked her. But these were two examples that one of which I found, one of which Kat pointed out. First is there are out there, you can buy a t-shirt for Don't Vote for Stupid, whoever that might be referring to for you, given your various political persuasions.
It's a very flexible slogan, really.
And that's, I did not make this. This was on the interweb and is out there. You can find it in whatever flavor you desire. And then what was more interesting was the references here in Doctor Who, the specifically the 2005 Christmas special. So we're only talking, 6-8 months after the movie came out.
That's very striking.
We get the reference to Anything Else He's Got Two Of, which is a line specifically from the movie, I believe. I don't remember it being from any of the
that really jumped out at me, because I've seen this Doctor Who episode before and got the joke about being in your pajamas and everything. But then watching the movie, suddenly anything else he's got two of, I thought, well, that's a Doctor Who reference. But I'm pretty sure that line is original to the Hitchhikers movie, right? Like that's not in the novel.
No. I couldn't find it in
it cracks me up that within a calendar year, and it's not even far from the most popular adaptation or version of Hitchhiker's Guide. Doctor Who is referencing the movie version like 6 months later, basically.
And then in that same episode, you get the reference to a man in his gym jams, very Arthur Dent, which isn't necessarily specifically referring to the movie, but sort of coupled with the other reference, seems pretty damning. I don't know.
Yeah. I would have guessed that when the Doctor actually alludes to Arthur Dent, I would have assumed he was making a reference to the TV series, because Arthur's being in his PJs is not something that gets a lot of emphasis in the book. We know that he's like lying in front of the bulldog. It's true if you kind of think it through, but no one ever brings it up that I recall after he's on the Vogon ship. I don't think is there a single reference to him still being in his PJs? I can't remember one. It's not an obtrusive element of the story. Whereas you get it, even in the picture that you had of the TV, of the TV from the TV series, the image that you had way back in one of the first slides, Curtis, still had him in his robe, right? So you can see that's that there, right? Yeah. He's in a bathrobe, right? So you can see that it's that element of it, which again is derived from the book, but is already sort of made a bigger deal of. So anyway. So Kat, just back to your point, I would never have thought, it would never even have occurred to me that when David Tennant refers to Arthur Dent, that it was alluding to the film, to the Martin Freeman film. But yeah, anything else he's got two of, that seems comparatively smoking gunnish, because that is not in any other adaptation.
Oh, you know what? Mike is saying it's in the TV show. That line.
It is?
Oh, is it?
Oh, that's what Mike says. I don't know. We might have to go fact check.
You might have to go back and look. Maybe. It's not that I can't imagine it being in anything else, but it comes up, of course, in the film in the context of Arthur's rivalry with Zaphod, with the love interest, with Trillian, which is of course so much more played up.
Right, because he's got two heads. Yeah. Right. No, I think we need a fact-finding mission to, who has access to TV show.
Mike is specifying it's not the line he was talking about. It's the pajamas that they emphasize the pajamas in the thing. But Mike, are you saying that it is also in the annotated script? I'm having a hard time following Mike's comments here, but yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well,
no. Right. Okay. He said actually there is a comment about they do make a penis joke in the film in the TV series as well. So.
Gotcha. Well, I'm curious if it's worded exactly the same, because it's verbatim between, So I
Yeah.
I still would like to see. I need to go track down the TV series clearly, but I also like the way, we're talking about which version of the story is the Doctor alluding to, but the way he says, "Now there was a nice man," implies that he has met him.
Met him, right? Yeah.
There's that element too.
I had the same thought. I'm glad that you did too. Is we were talking about, if the Doctor is someone, who would it be? And it's like this is bringing it like, oh yeah, of course the Doctor has met.
The Doctor, yeah.
Right.
There the whole time, so yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, and even just think about the significance of that as a nod, right? The fact that, in writing the Doctor Who Christmas special, they are imagining the Doctor Who fictional world as continuous with the Hitchhiker's Guide world, right? That's a really pronounced nod to Adams's world there, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Mike is clarifying that the penis joke is implied in the costuming.
Right. It's
so
not
I think
verbal.
that specific line of dialogue as spin on the joke seems to originate from what I can tell with the movie. So it's just funny little connection.
Oh, that's
Definitely. Well, unless there are any other final burning thoughts, I think we can put this one to bed. But yeah, no, this is, I mean, I was a little worried when we sort of committed to doing the movie version of this after the book was, because like I think we decided this kind of even before we had done any movie club, episodes, and we knew that Hitchhiker's Guide was coming up, and also that the 40th anniversary of the radio series is in like March, like it's only a couple weeks away at most. And so we were kind of like, oh, the timing seems to work out. And then thinking back on it, I was like, I've seen that movie, and like I don't really remember it that well. Like, is it good? Like, should this be something we're even talking about? I mean, so I don't know. Well, and I was going to say, like, I don't know, just because we've talked about it for a little over 2 hours doesn't necessarily mean that we've answered that question particularly.
Right.
Like,
it doesn't prove it's good. Yeah,
we can get together and talk for 2 hours about a movie, regardless of
right.
Its importance or worthiness. But no, I think this was turned out to be a much better discussion than I feared it could have been. And I think to Dom's point, like a lot of it does hold up better than even I remembered having seen it. I don't remember exactly when. I did not see it in the theater. I saw it after it came out on video, but it maybe wasn't long after. But even so, like 10 years later, it's still a worthy movie. I feel like it's worthy. I guess sort of the last thing I would say, and not to say that I have to have the last word. Feel free to add to this, is one of the points, and I admit I threw this in there as a triggering comment for all of our Tolkien fans, of which I am also one. But Jeremiah Kipp in Slant wrote, almost every narrative thread goes unresolved, and not in that Fellowship of the Ring way that's paving the way for sequels. Which, of course, we know they're not really sequels; they're just continuations of the story because it's all one story. I get it, but it is kind of surprising, given this day and age of franchise, and given that Hitchhiker's Guide already is such a franchise in and of itself, that they didn't seem to write this with a sequel in mind. Like, it's a story; it gets wrapped up. I mean, yes, there are certainly ways that you could see that they might take it if they were to do a sequel. And I guess for a very brief period of time, there was potential talk of a sequel, although it didn't do well enough in the box office to sort of justify that, at least in the movie studio executives' eyes. Yeah, I don't know. I just, so we're not going to talk about this, at least in Film Club again. Maybe at some point we'll talk about other adaptations in some other Mythgard capacity, but there isn't a sequel to go to. There isn't anything. And I guess I found that kind of odd in reflection, not necessarily when I was watching it or anything, but pointing out that they don't do any kind of setup that you would expect. Even in a movie today where you're not sure if there will be a sequel, you always feel like they leave that back door open, and I don't feel like that happened here.
Yeah.
And so just kind of wanted to throw that out there. But
exactly, and Curtis, especially thinking of the point you were making about the restaurant at the end of the universe joke at the end, right? That's the thing that surprised me most about it, because of course the reference to the restaurant at the end of the universe at the end of the book is explicitly that, the paving a way for the sequel thing. It's like a transition. It is explicitly a teaser in the book for the next part of the story, right? And the fact that they took that, there was a built-in teaser for a sequel in the story that they're adapting, and they twisted, they took that out, right? They made it into a sort of standalone joke instead of a teaser for for a sequel. So yeah, I was noticing that too, that it seemed surprisingly uninterested in sequels.
Well, then we won't have to talk about it anymore.
Exactly.
All right.
So I guess we're done.
So I guess we're done. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you back here. What was it, March 29th for
Wrinkle in
for
Time.
A Wrinkle in Time?
Wrinkle in Time.
That's right.
It's not a long book. Go read it.
That's right. Go read the book. There's still time to read the book before the film comes out. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. The Mythgard Academy has been offering in-depth discussions of awesome books and films since 2013, completely free to attend and free to download. If you've enjoyed our discussions and would like to help them continue, please consider donating at signumuniversity.org/fund.